Welcome to this rapid revision session on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you are unfamiliar with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the events in Selma in 1965, I will recap some of them briefly, but I would urge you to see those rapid revision videos first. But if you're ready to continue, let's get into it. A reminder of the events in Selma. Following televised attacks on protesters in Selma, Alabama in March 1965, President Johnson gave a speech in support of civil rights, using the phrase associated with the civil rights movement, "We shall overcome." Johnson signed an executive order so that the National Guard escorted the marches all the way to Montgomery. Hundreds of marchers, black and white, from all over the country took part, some of whom suffered a racist and violent backlash afterwards. This proved, though, that there was sufficient support for a Voting Rights Act to pass through Congress, and pass it did. Key law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's Johnson signing that very act. On August the 6th of 1965, the Voting Rights Act added extra safeguards to the Civil Rights Act. 1. Voting registration requirement enforced by the federal government united all of the states. States could set up voter qualification rules, but only with federal approval. Those that were seen to be deliberately discriminatory were obviously disallowed. Previously, states had to prove this themselves after the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Federal officials ran voter registration in any state and in all states where 50% of voters were registered to vote. And that's an important point. If under 50% of voters were registered to vote, it was usually a very good sign that large parts of the electorate, usually black people, were being deliberately prevented from voting. So this addressed many of the loopholes in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Let's briefly remind ourselves of Kennedy and Johnson and their attitudes to civil rights. Some historians see JFK as getting the ball rolling here, and then JFK finishing the job. John F. Kennedy, President 1961 to 63. He appointed black people to high-level jobs, Thurgood Marshall in the courts, for example, and Robert Weaver in his government, Thurgood Marshall being one of the important leaders of the NAACP during the era of Brown versus the Board of Education. JFK also pressed for new laws, but he was assassinated before they could be passed, so we'll never know how successful they would have been under his presidency. He also used instantaneous executive orders to support civil rights, for example, sending troops to Ole Miss to enforce desegregation for James Meredith. He also requested escorts to protect the Freedom Riders, a tactic that's similar to what Johnson did. President Johnson, or LBJ, took over after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He was president between 1963 and 1969 when he stepped down in light of failures in Vietnam. He also appointed black people to high-level jobs. Thurgood Marshall was by this point elevated to the Supreme Court, the first African-American to serve on it. Patricia Harris became the first black woman to serve as a United States ambassador. He also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we've just covered. He, like JFK, used executive orders to support civil rights. For example, he made the Alabama National Guard escort the marches from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, and he put pressure on Southern politicians like Governor George Wallace to support the Civil Rights Act, even though they really didn't want to most of the time. Let's consider the legal gains for black Americans up until the mid-1960s. Some of these have been the result of Supreme Court desegregation laws like Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. These had some effects, but not all of them were positive. They did result in some desegregation, often very specifically, but new rules were often created to create an unofficial segregation. Sometimes schools were shut rather than integrating them. Therefore, there needed to be federally enforced desegregation, as happened with Little Rock in 1957. Much of this resulted in white resentment and backlash. Much of it violent, some of it murderous. There were also gains through new laws, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These also had some effects. New rules were applied, but rules could often be ignored unless enforced by federal officials. After all, the Voting Rights Act needed to put right some of the loopholes of the original Civil Rights Act. This too resulted in white resentment. But in 1965, as in 1954, many black Americans still faced discrimination in housing, work, education, medical care, and treatment by the police. That meant that although there had been legal gains, it wasn't that noticeable. Many black Americans who were pushing for their legal rights faced racist violence, They needed the help of federal troops to succeed, and they were not accepted. They were still treated as second-class citizens, and many of them lost self-esteem as a result. This led to some frustration. Some black Americans felt that yes, there had been legal gains, but change and improvements in people's quality of life was not coming quickly enough. More needed to be done. Some final points then. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 looked to close some of the loopholes of the earlier Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like the Civil Rights Act, it was an important example of progress. However, there were still big issues. Importantly, on its own, the Voting Rights Act wouldn't change racist attitudes at all, nor would it immediately improve lives, and it shares that in common with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. However, by providing black Americans with the vote, they could begin to put pressure on politicians to change things, as they now needed black votes too. And surely that is how democracy is supposed to work. That's the end of this video on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I hope it's been useful for you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. That's all for now though. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.